This episode's made possible by Planful. Hello. On today's show, we'll be featuring FP&A insights and commentary of three finance leaders, including CFO Mark Sweden of the Beachbody Company, CFO David Freeman of Starburst, and CFO Emma Brown of Medius. This is Jack Sweeney, your co-host, along with performance management guru Brett Knowles, who'll serve as our resident thought leader as we seek to highlight the takeaways from our distinguished group of planning aces. We'll begin after this.
Hi, I'm Rowan Tonkin, Chief Marketing Officer at Planful, and we're a proud sponsor of CFO Thought Leader. At Planful, we're empowering teams just like yours to drive peak financial performance in every corner of your business. What sets Planful apart? We have purpose-built applications for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. This means we can get you up and running within weeks, and it requires minimal IT involvement. So you can rapidly and seamlessly engage everyone across the business in your key financial processes. Best of all, you can't outgrow us. We take the pain of growing away with an unmatched ability to scale with you. You have an endless runway with Planful. See why over 1,300 customers around the world choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Go to planful.com and see how you can make financial performance a team sport in your business.
Hi, it's Jack Sweeney, and I'm here with our resident thought leader, Brett Knowles, who in our last many episodes we've been touching on AI with. I have to say, Brett, and I should mention we have three, I think, outstanding planning aces to share with you this week. But back to AI, I have to believe that there's a real disparity between those organizations, say the world-class organizations that are really taking steps to begin using generative AI in their strategy development and what have you, versus the laggards who really haven't given it much thought yet. What are you seeing?
Well, certainly we're seeing huge differences globally. So in North America, a very high level of uptake compared to even in Europe and Asia. So definitely very different country by country. Inside the US, I would say, I'm pulling a number out my ear, but 80% of organizations are already using it as part of the FP&A. Now, of that, I would say only 10% are formally using it. The other portion of them are using it in sort of an ad hoc basis. An analyst is asking, ChatGPT specific questions about the plans and planning process. The dilemma that most organizations have is about privacy and data security. We just don't want stuff shared with chat, even though they tell us it's being secured. So there are some tools that profess to keep your data protected, but with a multi-billion-dollar corporation, you don't want to gamble on that. The key player in that space is Microsoft with their Copilot tools, and that seems to be getting most CIOs confidence that of that 10 or 15% that are using it extensively, they're using Copilot because Copilot allows you to keep access your planning data, but keep it private, but also access that the World Wide Web worth of knowledge. So that 10 to 15%, last year they're busy coding all their own stuff. Now they're piggybacking on Copilot, and that seems to be the dominant force right now.
Yeah, the LinkedIn experience, I think I mentioned this to you before, premium users anyway. LinkedIn, of course, owned by Microsoft, has added AI capabilities, and they keep on showing up in all different places. One of the ones I noticed this week is when you see a post of video or audio or what have you on LinkedIn, you can click on something called takeaways, and it'll quickly off to the side start telling you what some of the takeaways from what was shared, sort of bite-sized pieces, which is what we've seen AI capable of doing. But I think it's a smart thing that Microsoft is sort of educating the world. For those who might not have gone to ChatGPT yet, they might be regular LinkedIn users. At least that's how they got their last job. So it's a familiar turf for them to see how useful it can be at times.
Yeah, Microsoft has had an interesting push. So, last year's major push was every tool needed to have a Copilot in it. And so for the consumer, it looks like there's like 18 or 20 different Copilots. For example, the LinkedIn Copilot. But part of LinkedIn is their education training session. And so they've got a Copilot that can take a look at, what your career path has been, what you're currently doing, what you aspire to be, and therefore what training you should take. And it's, again, it's, what a career counselor would have done in the good old days when you had those things. Now AI is doing it for you. So it looks like there's 18 or 20 different Copilots. It's actually all one Copilot, but infused in their different products in a different way. And I suspect that this year is going to be more one of consolidation. So it doesn't look like 18 anymore. It goes back to one that helps you, or maybe, 5, an HR one, an ERP one, a sales one. But certainly, as you say, we're all getting exposed to it. And I think you're right. Microsoft happens to be doing a good job of infusing it in the products that you use, which is sort of getting us comfortable with it so that it's not a big bang. It's just getting eased into where it fits.
So we had 3 interesting planning aces, I think, for this episode. 2 of them involve turnarounds. What are some of the common themes you think that these 3 share?
Well, first off, I think it's an interesting segue because all 3 of them have stories about where they used their human brains to do what AI should be helping us do in the future. So they're great stories about human curiosity and creativity in addressing business problems. And, in theory, that's an area where AI is going to be of help to us. But of course, our current business needs, we don't have AI to help us out. To me, what I saw was that the common theme, the idea that as FP&A practitioners, it's not enough that we're awesome at FP&A. We also have to have just a grassroots understanding of how businesses operate. And in fact, if you do that, there's a high likelihood you're going to get pulled into other parts of the business beyond FP&A as an internal coach or consultant to help that area achieve the strategic objectives of the organization. So I see these 3 leaders as really illustrating the deep impact FP&A can have on executing strategy.
That notion of being a coach or being a consultant, I think, is visible among these 3 planning aces, maybe even more broadly. And that begins with Mark Sweden, who is CFO of the Beachbody company, which is undertaking a turnaround. Now, Mark Sweden is featured on episode 975. And we began that interview really by trying to understand why he took this role and asking him
what it was that made the CFO role at Beachbody of interest to him. And I think as a 17-year PwC partner, he's helped execute transformations for many tech companies. Sweden could have picked and choose roles from a menu of CFO opportunities, but he chose Beachbody. And what I think is interesting about what he shares in part is how he talks about the opportunity. His choice of words is different from many other CFOs, and that speaks to a long career as an advisor or as a consultant. And just to put a fine point on it, in response to our question, Mark, why did you choose Beachbody? And I kept on bringing it up. You'll hear him say that Beachbody, he'll say, had the right asset mix and the right governance to achieve a turnaround as a publicly held company. And I just thought, I was like, wow, that's not what we hear from other CFOs, but that's what we hear from an outsider. And it's a nice, again, you were talking about how we have to be FP&A professionals need to be good consultants, good influencers in other parts of the business. And here we have someone with a consultant
It's
mind.
funny. I thought the same thing. I thought, here's someone that's been doing this work for 17 years. Why did he choose to jump off the merry-go-round for this company? And I also picked up on that same point about assets and governance. But I like the third qualifier. He said, they had the right assets, and they're obviously underperforming assets, the right governance that allowed him to help make the change happen.
So let's play the clip of CFO Mark Sweden. We'll tee things off with Mark, and then come back and talk about it some more. This is Mark Sweden from episode 475 of CFO Thought Leader.
So it's actually 2 years into it. And when I arrived, we took a step back and we, the whole management team together, we put together a plan of what we want to be and where we need to get to. That plan had three underlying big pillars. Number one, you have to dramatically cut costs. You ain't gonna dig your way out in a shrinking market by increasing demand, right? So that's number one. Number two, Beachbody had the best content in the world, didn't have the right digital experience around that content. We had to fix that. And then number three, fix our nutrition business. Interestingly enough about Beachbody, very few people know that, half its business is digital subscriptions and half of it is nutritional supplements that people who work out consume. People take energy drinks before working out. They take protein supplements afterwards. So this is all part of the health supplements that Beachbody offers. So those are the three big things. On the first one, I mean, it's a bit absurd, but we're on track to have created over $200 million of savings in less than 2 years. I mean, it's just crazy for a company this size that you could find this much so fast. So talk about a team that's moving at warp speed to transform the company. Number two, in declining budgets, we were able to revamp that digital experience I was talking about. That was launched in March of 2023. And by December, to our favorable surprise, it was rated the best fitness and workout app by CNN. So mission two, accomplished, right? Well, with declining budgets, you revamped the digital experience and got awarded that, because that was not something we sponsored in any way. We honestly found that in the news like everybody else. Now we're down to number three, which is this other half of the business called nutrition, a healthy growing market. Why is ours declining? And it's declining because of mispositioning, lack of diversified channels. So we're in the process right now of executing on that one. So I'd say we're 2/3 of the way of where we need to get to. And we have this last third. So this is a big year for us. And that's why I said at the beginning, when you asked me about why Beachbody, like I told you, it had the right assets, but it also had the right governance to help us execute this in the public markets. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing this in the public markets. Doing turnarounds in public markets is too tough, right? You're not thinking quarter to quarter. We designed this to think on a 2-year time frame, and we're on track to achieve what we wanted to within that time frame. My FP&A team is really talented in working with the different business leaders, where they got to say, here's what I think the business will do. Once again, it's a consumer business. It's not a Salesforce driven. In a classic Salesforce business, you say I have 1,000 sales reps. They're each on average going to sell $1 million. Here's how I get to my revenue number. We don't have that, right? We have LTV to CAC, lifetime value, customer acquisition costs, marketing spend. So we compile all that from the business, and then we translate that into how it turns into GAAP looks. But then we also risk assess it to say, dear business leader, it's great we think you're going to do this, but we don't think that's possible, right? So we always present two lenses. One is, here's what the business says they're going to do. Two is, here's what we really think it's going to be, right? And then, we facilitate discussion with management to make sure, like, where do we want our forecast to be? You want to go with where the submission per se or the risk assess ones? And I would say in times where cash is tight, you're going to go with the more conservative one, but push the business to deliver on the more optimistic one.
Well, that's CFO Mark Sweden, who tells us he believes he's come 2/3 of the way down the turnaround path at the Beachbody Company. And again, I believe he brings a consultant's mindset to the business.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that. What to you makes a consulting mindset?
I think too often finance leaders need distance. They are sometimes they have to have an out of body experience and look at their company from the outside. Now, that's the sense I got from Mark. And again, I'm not. It can be a negative if you say, "Oh, he's always the outsider," but I think he has a way of looking at the challenges from 1,000 feet that allow him to make better decisions.
And that's what you define as a consulting mindset.
As an outsider who comes in with a fresh perspective.
Then I think we should all have that consulting mindset, like the ability to be the fly in the wall that's looking at the process, right? You get this feeling of him being a chess master, right? He has his three moves, right? He's going to cut costs, he's going to get that digital experience put in place, and then reposition the nutritional supplements. Very clear, and then he goes off and executes it. And we all need that ability to both work in the business and work on the business. So it's three strategies. You're working on the business. This is the structure that we need to do and where we have to go. And then he immediately gets into the business, like the hand-to-hand combat of making this thing work. And I think that's a super important message for all of us in the FP&A space. We think all we've got to do is be that chess master calling the shots from the outside. But it's, the devil's in the details, the moment-to-moment meetings and helping people make those right decisions. He gives himself accolades for, doing that 200 million cost cutting in a year and getting the digital experience done, it turns out, in a year as well. But obviously that wasn't done by him calling the shots and then sitting on the beach and watching it happen. There's a million meetings he sat through and conversations that he had. So I think that's super important that we recognize that you need to be part of it. How he described it is, it's not the business versus, and he had the example of business's optimistic forecast compared to FP&A's realistic forecasts. And these days we're seeing many organizations run with effectively two forecasts: committed and stretch. Committed is the number that you got to hit. And then stretch is where we would like you to use your creativity to do better. So there's some areas I don't want to stretch. I know that the customer only wants this, and there's no point in doing better than that. There's other areas where there's room for improvement. Let's set a stretch goal there so that as you work, we stretch in areas that will add value to the enterprise.
I think it might be interesting for us to quickly feature our next planning ace here, because it's a nice segue from what Mark Sweden was just sharing. That planning ace is CFO David Freeman, who shares how during an earlier chapter in his career, he was rotated in from finance into a sales operations role.
He was actually compensated as a salesperson. As he explained, it was all about closing business in short windows, not a long-term view. But at the same time, like many FP&A professionals, they have these sojourns. And David's lasted 4 years, so he got a full blast of Salesforce knowledge.
Spent 2 years building out the finance team, and it was great. Company was growing, but I kind of 2 years in, kind of started getting kind of an itch to do something different and do something more. And kind of coincidental, our VP of Sales Ops moved to a new position, and our head of sales reached out to me and said, "Hey, you work so closely with sales. you're very engaged. You have a very good thought process in that area. Have you ever thought about moving into sales? And to be honest, I really hadn't thought about it that much. It's something I kind of played around with operations a little bit when I was at Zscaler previously, but never really kind of made that thought to make that full move. But I've kind of felt like, hey, if there's a time to do it, why not? Let's give it a try. So I moved into sales and ended up being responsible for a bunch of sales functions, inside sales, sales operations, sales enablement. I eventually picked up the global system integrator team. So I had a partner team, and gave me a very different perspective, like a lot more empathy for salespeople. I think a lot of finance people look at sales and feel like, hey, it's easy. They go to all these fun events and they travel a lot, and kind of being on that other side gave me a lot more empathy of that stress. I mean, I was on a comp plan. 50% of my compensation was variable and was at risk every quarter. And being in that world is a very different feeling than being in finance, when it's all about right and wrong answers. And there's just a lot more nuance that you have to deal with, and really enjoyed that. I mean, I think it's very short-term focus. And I think it's like in any company, you need some people with long-term focuses. You want your product and your engineering teams with a long-term focus. But in sales, it's a very short-term focus. We run 90 days at a time, and you're only as good as your last quarter. And there's more turnover in the sales orgs than in any other company. And I think a lot of it is due to that. One is you have to perform, and your performance is measured for all to see, right? Like, everybody knows who's good in sales and who's not good in sales. And it's a lot either harder to see or a little more obfuscated in other organizations. And I think there's a different level of stress, but also excitement and energy, right? Like, you believe you're controlling your own destiny. Sometimes in other functions, you're part of a bigger company, a bigger group. And sometimes I think you can feel like you're along for the ride. I think it's great for no matter what function you're in, though, to try to take some of that sales mentality of that 90-day, what can I do in the quarter? What are my results? And not just say, hey, if I don't get something done this quarter, I'll do it next quarter. Bringing some of that kind of sales mentality of, hey, we only operate a month at a time and a quarter at a time, I think kind of can bring some more urgency to everyone.
David Freeman, I think, bringing forth something of a consulting mindset there. And I should mention, by the way, that David will be featured on episode 977 of CFO Thought Leader.
The takeaway, again, is both working in and on the business. Like, to me, that's the smooth connection between the two. But what's interesting about David's story, and many large corporations have management development tracks for young buck MBAs, and you spend 4 years in one department and 4 years in the next department, 4 years in the next department. And that's what they also do in the Army, in the Air Force, in the Navy. So by the time you're 55 or 60 and you become a general, you have a pretty good, solid foundation of understanding of all parts of the enterprise. What's interesting about Dave is he accidentally ended up in one of those scenarios. He ended up in a out-of-department experience, as they call it, in this case, sales. And his takeaway was, hey, it's a very different job, but there's a whole bunch of things that the salespeople do that I now understand and can empathize with. Yay for that. But more importantly, that I can take back with me to the FP&A world. So things like this, 90-day cycle. Like we all think that we're running for the next stock update, but this idea of, as he so passionately described it, that, you live and die based on the last sale and the last 90 days. And so the cadence of that, and this is an important issue. I always think of like old mechanical watches where some gears move once a second, some move once an hour, some move once a month. Different departments have a different cadence. And that cadence, you've got to plan around that cadence. I have to, in his example, recognize that the sales department has a 90-day cadence. Marketing might have a quarterly cadence. And, us in finance, maybe we've got an annual cadence for the annual statements and so forth. So the idea is FP&A has to accommodate that, but there's lessons to be learned from each department that can apply to the others. So, the ability to be transparent, the ability, and his point of, in sales, everyone knows who's doing a good job and who's doing a bad job. How do we emulate that in FP&A? How do we let people know who are FP&A rock stars and who are the ones that aren't necessarily performing as well. Right now, we kind of politely keep that under the covers and don't make it explicit. Maybe there's something to learn from sales of making that performance transparent. That's what happens in any sports team. Like you can't, I don't know, in soccer, you can't be bad at defense and everyone else doesn't see it.
That's really an interesting. I haven't really thought too much about that. Haven't read too much about that. But the transparency in sales has always been there.
And sales is known for its unique culture. So
yeah, it is. And I've always said that the closer you are to the customer, the easier it is to measure performance. So obviously, Salesforce, slam dunk easy, or the customer support team, or even the IT people that are solving trouble tickets and so forth. Those are really easy to measure. When I get up to the CEO or the board, it becomes pretty tough because they're far away from the customer, and most of their work is project based, not process based. So obviously, it's easy to get that visibility in those customer facing functions. But in ours, FP&A, we can simulate it. I mean, we still have customers. You have internal customers. We still have deliverables. We got to get the plans done. We got to manage variances. We've got to be that coach and that advisor. There's a whole bunch of data that's available that we're not using. We could actually make that available. No different than when you walk into a sales room, they often have a leaderboard on the wall with, who's got what in their pipeline and who's got more sales and so on. What if we did that for FP&A? What if we said, this person's, managed to knock out 5 plans. They're, covering, 555 people. Their budget variance year to date has been 3%. And the next person, what would that feel like?
I'm kind of skeptical of that without that hard number as to what they brought in last quarter, last month, they'll never achieve that type of transparency to put out a report card like that, as powerful as that.
Jack, I can't believe you said that. I hope you have some scissors and cut that out of the podcast. That is so unbelievable. Well, so let's talk about that for a second. In the FP&A world, and I could do the same thing about your podcast, but we do the FP&A world because that's what we're here to talk about. So my examples I gave you of taking a look at, think of the average FP&A person. No different than the salesperson has to drag in new business. That FP&A person has to drag in a new plan. Somehow they've got to work with that department and take the chaos and anarchy that's happening in that department and come up with a plan. And, what we heard, Mark talk about was the difference between the business's optimistic plan and what FP&A does. Well, someone's got to facilitate that conversation, help close the gap, get both the committed number and the stretched number agreed to and push it forward. That's their sale. That's their success. That's what they should get compensated for. And the complexity of the org. So there's a whole bunch of metrics about their ability to do that, right? Easily available. Now, there's also a different complexity level in different departments. Some departments are super easy to plan for. If I was to do a financial plan for the accounting department, it'd be pretty easy. Doing a financial plan for the sales department, not as easy. Doing a financial plan for an R&D department, really tough, just because of how complex and unpredictable the environment is. So I should be able to, who my rock stars in the sales world, they're the ones that get the key accounts and the strategic accounts. And the Padawans, they start off with, the same thing in FP&A. You start off doing financial planning for the accounting department. When you get better, you move up to sales. When you get better marketing and so on. So all those things are immensely there. And the data is abundantly available. I know, did they get it done? Did they sit through? Are they invited back to the planning meetings? Are they actually catching the variances before they get out of control? Are they writing the right reports? What data is not available that we could not put that leaderboard up for our FP&A staff? It's abundantly available. And there are many tools out there that actually analyze that data. We'll take a look at your Outlook calendar and go, how many meetings did you go? Did you actually book off time in your day to do focus work? For those meetings you went to, were you ever assigned any work to do? Because if you were, did you get it done? And if you weren't assigned, Do people think you're just a fifth wheel and you're just consuming oxygen in the room? Like, all that data is currently available. And we talked about AI. AI could give you the analysis not only of the transcript of the meeting, but the participation of the people in the meeting. Wouldn't that be interesting? So now anyway, so I'll get off that for a second. But the whole idea is we're happy to go do that with the sales team. Why is that resistance there to do it with the FP&A team? Why should they be different? Your only answer is just because that's how it's always been. But what I'm trying to describe is, I understand in the old days when it was close to the customer, better data. That is the old days. That is no longer the modern world. And, it's immensely measurable, all this knowledge creating business that we're in. Why aren't we doing it? And I'm picking on the FP&A team. I could pick on just as well the customer support team or the engineering team or the R&D team. We have all that data available and we're not using it.
Well, this is the sort of the time of year where many companies take their salespeople off to Caribbean islands for their annual sales conferences. Maybe the FP&A teams need to have a similar ritual.
Why not? Why not, right? The idea of those sales things are a couple of things. One, just escape from the day-to-day transactions so I get quality brains for a couple of days. Do a whole bunch of team building, share best practices and knowledge, and come back with sort of an inspired state. What department and organization would not benefit from that?
Would the sales VP or the sales the revenue chief revenue officer permit the finance team to sort of party with the sales team on their annual event? Anyway,
well, no, that's taking it up to a new level. But wouldn't that be fun? Because how often do we talk about getting the FP&A team out of the office and into the operating unit, right? Working shoulder to shoulder not only creates the empathy that David's talking about, but a way better knowledge of what's going on. Like the theme here is FP&A is not apart from the business. We have to both work on the business and work in the business. And we've only been chasing examples of where that is currently not the case, right? It's currently not the case that they have the week off. Why in the Caribbean or wherever to do that team building thing? Currently not having the leaderboard. And all these things, if you knock on them hard, they fall over. Like they're just because rules that when you talk to someone like David, he stepped on the other side and he's brought back that new mindset. That's what's interesting about David's story.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, too, that the 3 clips, and we're up to our 3rd planning ace, they're all from different environments. As David explains his environment, he's sort of at that place looking back at a chapter in his career where he was deployed into the sales operations. Again, Mark Sweden came from, the world of advisory. And he has been a change agent. He had this change agent reputation. And then there's Emma Brown, who we're about to hear from Medius. Now, she's also talking about an earlier chapter. And what's interesting about her ecosystem, or where she came from, and again, we're always trying to reveal some of the networking in the greater ecosystem that transports CFO talent into their positions via Mark's story. Emma's story is about private equity. And she more or less has, I think this is an earlier company, but with the same PE investor that she is currently working in a company that's owned by that same PE investor. Anyway, she's known as a troubleshooter. She arrives. Here's what Emma shares with us.
The most important realization or strategic moment that I've had in my career has been that if something seems too complicated, then it probably is. And I think that this can apply to everything. It can apply to processes, strategy, systems, org structure, decision making, kind of everything. And I think this realization is important because it gave me a lot of confidence. I'd previously feel like if there's something in the business that I'm not quite understanding or something that I'm not getting across, that's my own shortcoming and I need to work harder to understand it. But actually, sometimes it is just too complicated. And I came to this realization when I was working in an extremely kind of high pressure situation. It was a turnaround situation. I'd recently joined the business. There was extremely poor visibility into the finances and cash flow. And I basically had to strip everything back that was being done in finance and go completely back to basics in terms of even looking at bank statements to understand what money is coming in, what money is going out, when's it going out, how much do we actually have in the bank, how many people do we have employed, when are they being paid, what supplier commitments do we have. And I literally had to build a cash flow from the ground up to identify how long we had until we breached covenants and where we could pull levers to kind of avoid that sort of liquidity event. And that situation, that kind of burning platform, had all come about due to poor financial systems, reporting, forecasting, and creating, this huge gap between the expected performance of the business and the reality. So the bottom-up kind of back to basics exercise demonstrated to me that, all of this complexity that the business had in terms of this large ERP system, the multiple layers of people in the finance team, the kind of convoluted way they were reporting results and forecasting, and this kind of web of dashboards and adjustments that were being made to financials that were presented to leadership were all just kind of getting in the way of anybody really understanding the performance and anyone being able to identify and then fix the kind of underlying business problem. When we went back to basics in terms of like money in, money out, it was very easy to identify that there was this deficit in the working capital cycle. There was an overly ambitious front loading of kind of growth investment. And when that growth wasn't coming through quick enough, we were getting very quickly into kind of hot water. So with the simplified approach that I had, we were then able to build this plan around what should the cost base be, based on the actual cash inflows that we're getting today, not based on some kind of lofty growth plan, but based on today, what's our sustainable cost base? How do we take action very, very quickly to get the company onto an even keel? And we were able to prioritize investments that were very closely linked to revenue generation. So we could see that tangible link between, we spend money on this, we'll get more inflows. Or they were very linked to other cost reductions that we can make elsewhere in the business. And that allowed myself and the management team to really see what's going to work to not only stabilize this business, but then grow it into the future. From that, we set 4 really simple strategic initiatives for the business to align around for the next 12 months to just get us to a place of kind of safety and hopefully back to some level of growth. And actually what happened was those 4 initiatives were completely the right ones. They set us off on a profitable growth path. And we went from kind of losing 40 million USD a year to 15 million of profit for the next 12 months, like sort of literally overnight, by just pulling out of the business all of this kind of complexity and additional investment that wasn't delivering kind of any return. And since then, I've kind of employed that strategy in every business. I've come in and instead of getting caught up in the complexity of everything that's being done today, I've taken a step back and thought, okay, let me just cut through the noise and see what are the 4 things that we should be doing to increase value in this business. And that is what we're going to do, and then aligning kind of the management team around them. And that's the approach that I've taken at Medius in the last few months since I've been here. And I think it's really helped to provide additional clarity to the organisation in terms of what we want to achieve. And it's a simple message for the whole organisation to get on board with and to know exactly how their job can contribute to those kind of 4 things that we're all working towards.
Our thanks again to CFO Emma Brown of Medius for joining us on episode 965. Brett, again, certain similar themes. Do you agree?
Yeah, if you remember, Mark had his 3 steps of what he's going to go do. He's done step 1, step 2, he's partway through step 3. Same thing here. She had her steps, she went through it. She said, great, now that we've got that done, we're going to move into our 4 initiatives. And this is the beginning of what those results look like. So again, what's interesting is both working in and on the business. on the business, here's the game plan, then stepping into it, because she was definitely in there doing hand-to-hand combats, right? She's talking about literally having to take a look at bank statements to come up to figure out what the free cash flow statement was, because they didn't have one, and figuring out, why they had the bad financial plans and the bad financial reportings. The interesting twist to her that I really loved was the idea that she stepped into a world that had every bell and whistle, every complicated ERP system that you could think of, and they were suffering from bureaucratic bloat. The processes were so big and so complicated, they stopped doing their job. And I'd have to add a political comment, being from Canada, that's the problem that we have in our country, where with a very liberal government, it keeps on bloating and getting bigger and bigger, and the bureaucratic process gets more and more complicated. As a taxpayer, not only do I spend literally over half my year working for the government to pay my taxes, there's another 20% that's invisible that I'm filling in crazy forms to meet government agendas. So, for example, we've got a housing crisis. I now have to spend 20 minutes filling in a form to say I live in my house. And for the government, it looks like it's free. They now get the data. They can say, gosh, we're helping solve. But it just took 20 minutes of revenue out of the system. It took 20 minutes of productivity. And Emma's in a world where they had these nice, big, intensive systems that had got bloated so that they were no longer doing their intended purpose of giving people effective financial information. And that is a problem that we see in many organizations, right? That's the dilemma of complex versus complicated. So complicated is building a car, a lot of little parts that all have to fit together. Complex is building an 8-year-old. Kids are unpredictable. You can't do something one day that has the same outcome as when you do it the next day. And we're trying to solve complex systems, organizations, with complicated solutions, with more and more bureaucracy. And so she kind of said, let's take a big step back. Let's pull out all this complicated processes and get back to the essence, which in fact is forcing people to use their brain as they do to their day-to-day operations, as opposed to waiting for the system to tell them what to do.
Yeah, and she was in sort of lockstep, I think, with Mark Sweden on being adaptable and flexible in turnaround situations, just getting that thought across. And of course, as you already emphasized, it was about removing flexibility, or something she's really key to express very clearly. They both, I thought, did express things very clearly. Mark boiled it down to those nice 3 pillars, but she I thought was terrific when she just said, this is a simplification task. We need to get rid of the clutter.
Right. And the gem of what she said, I think, is after you went through all the story about, the complex systems and simplifying things and so on, once she had accomplished that, once she'd simplified the system, the key point was management was then in better control. Right. So, I picked on politics for a while. I'll move on to cars, right? If you think of an old car that didn't have power steering and power brakes and so on, man, you felt the road. You were part of where you're at. Now we're in these big gushy cars with all sorts of dynamic, suspensions and power steering and power brakes and all these sensors around us and stuff. You are no longer in control, right? You're sort of navigating along. I mean, in Tesla, you're not even in control. You're just sort of hanging out while it's gone. So is that difference of, how do I strip this thing back to the old sports car, the essence of what the organization's about, and get rid of all that other kind of gunk that gets in the way? Now, obviously there's a right place between it, but she's a good example of what happens when you overcompensate in either direction.
So all three, just to review, what they have in common,
how they arrived, how they got their orientation, how they simplify, remove clutter. How am I doing?
No, I mean, I would go back and beat that same drum that, all three of them had different techniques, but they're all battling bloat. They're all battling organizations that had got soft and comfortable with themselves, and they needed to get back in shape. And I'm not saying that just because Beachbody helps people get back in shape, but the whole idea that we do have to go through those regrowth, re-engineering. We talked earlier on in this conversation about that sales team going off to the Caribbean for a week. That's that regrowth. Like, how do you stop for a moment and replot your way forward? I remember this adage. I'm not sure I can get it quite right, but it said something like, really smart people learn from other people's mistake. The average person learns from their own mistake, and dumb people don't learn from either. And these three stories are great opportunities for us to learn from other people's mistakes or opportunities, right? Each of them brings a different gem to the table. Like I liked Mark's idea of understanding what is the right conditions to make change. In his case, having the assets and the governance in place in a public traded organization, having a firm game plan, his 3 steps that he was going to go through. I like David's idea of we can learn from other departments and bring their best practices along with us as we go back. In his case, all the things he learned from the sales side. And of course, Emma's story about simplification. Those are all things that if we practiced ourselves, great things could happen.
Brett, thank you again for once more joining us on Planning Aces.
It's fun. I always love hearing the interesting people that you've had conversations with. I envy you for being forced every single day to have more interesting conversations.
Yeah, somebody's got to do it, I'm afraid. So, but no, we're fortunate to have such good guests. So thank you, Brett. Safe travels.
Okay, buddy. See you later.